What's up guys, welcome to my Retribution Paladin DPS guide for Legion patch 7.1. Now in this guide I'm going to go over your spells and abilities, your talents, your artifact traits and paladin choices, your stat priority, and then your DPS rotation as well as a demonstration of that, and then just macros and add-ons you can use to help yourself out. Now go ahead and start with your spells and abilities, and I want to start by talking about your alternative resource, your holy power. And basically you can have up to 5 at any given time, and some of your abilities will generate holy power for you, and some will spend it. So to build holy power, you've got 2 abilities. First is Crusader Strike, is a short cooldown melee ability, and it does a little bit of damage and gives you 1 holy power, like so. The other is Blade of Justice, got a longer cooldown, a small range on it, 12 yards or so, and it does more damage and generates 2 holy power, like so. Now to spend holy power, you have 2 options. Templar's Verdict is the single target option, costs 3 holy power, does some damage, pretty straightforward. And the AoE option is called Divine Storm. Now Divine Storm also costs 3 holy power, and normally it will just spin around you and do a little AoE damage to everything around you. My artifact trait makes it kind of shoot forward, but it looks a little bit like this, and just does some AoE damage around you. Then you also have an ability called Judgment, which is ranged about 30 yards. And it applies a debuff that makes your holy power spenders do more damage to the targets that it hits. It also, of course, does damage on its own as well. So you can toss it, and it does split to 1 extra target at most. So if they're close enough, it will jump as you just saw. It does a little damage and applies that debuff to both targets. And again, that debuff makes them take more damage from your Templar's Verdict and Divine Storm. Then we have your artifact trait, or your ability, and it's called Wake of Ashes. Now normally it just does a conal attack in front of you. When you get your Ashes to Ashes golden trait up here, which we'll get into a little bit later, it also gives you holy power and does extra damage as damage over time. It looks a little bit like this. It's on a 30-second cooldown, and so you see it kind of hits in this big cone in front of you. Now that's pretty much it for offensive abilities. Now, as far as your big DPS cooldowns, other than Wake of Ashes, which is kind of like a short cooldown, you do have Avenging Wrath, and right now for me it's called Crusade because I have the talent that replaces it. But Avenging Wrath is a 2-minute cooldown, and for 20 seconds you do a lot more damage and healing. Pretty simple, pretty straightforward. Crusade's a little trickier to use, but we'll get into that in a later section. Now, I want to get into your greater blessings. And you have 3 of these as a Retribution Paladin, and they are Might, Kings, and Wisdom. Now, just a couple notes about these. You can only have 3 at a time, so it doesn't matter what kind you have, just 3 greater blessings on any person. So just 3. If you try to put more on, it will reset the first one, it will kind of remove that. And the second thing is you have to apply them out of combat. So make sure you do that before the pull happens. And if somebody happens to die with one of your blessings on, you can't reapply it, unfortunately, mid-fight. Now normally you'll be using Might. You won't be using Kings or Wisdom as much. Kings is just a very negligible absorb shield, so not really that useful. The least useful of the 3. And Wisdom does give some mana and health regen, but it takes such a long time, and ticks every 15 seconds for like 1%. It's very, very low. That's not generally that useful. So I recommend Might most of the time in group content, and basically we put it on the top DPS, so the best DPS in your group. Now if you want to really dig into it and find out who's best for you, keep logs, like Warcraft logs or something, and look at those at the end of each raid fight. Try it on different people on the same fight week after week, and you can tell, it'll tell you if you look through it, who is giving you the most bang for your buck, who's giving you like the most might damage, because it will split it from each source. I have been using it mostly on consistent high DPS, so DPS that's not based solely around their burst, because just for RNG's sake, because if you're lucky, right, you get a lot of might procs during their burst, but if you're not lucky and you get a lot of might procs outside of the burst, you're not going to get as much damage and so on. That's kind of my reasoning for now, but just to make sure, just use logs, different people, same fight, same type of fight too, every week, and just kind of see who's giving you the most damage. Now for defensive cooldowns, you do have mainly your Shield of Vengeance, and Shield of Vengeance is a 2-minute cooldown. Mine is a bit shorter because of artifact traits, but basically it creates a shield around you, a little absorption barrier, looks like this, and it's based on how much it absorbs is based on your attack power at the time, and if it goes through, if enemies do enough damage to blow up your shield, it will actually explode and deal damage to everything around you based on the amount of damage absorbed. It's kind of a nice defensive offensive ability, 2-in-1. And then we have Divine Shield, kind of your big oh crap button. And what it is a 5-minute cooldown with, like, it just gives you immunity to all damage. Makes you immune, you don't take any damage, removes debuffs, and so on. Mine is 2.5 minutes because of a talent I have chosen, but it applies this debuff called Forbearance. Now, I'll go over the other two abilities that give you Forbearance as well, before I get into what that does exactly. The first is Lay on Hands, 10-minute cooldown, full heal. Pretty simple, it heals someone for the maximum amount of health you have, so in my case about 2.1 million. And then of course applies Forbearance. And then Blessing and Protection, the 5-minute cooldown removes all physical debuffs from the target and prevents physical damage from going through and harming that target. Now you can attack while you have Blessing and Protection on, no matter what kind of class you are, melee or ranged or caster and so on, but it does remove threats, so be careful about using it on tanks. Now Forbearance is a debuff that comes on when you use one of these abilities. I'll use Divine Shield for example, and it makes it so I cannot use or be affected by any of those three abilities. So someone cannot Lay on Hands me, I can't Lay on Hands myself, same with Blessing and Protection, until this debuff goes away. Other abilities you do have include, of course, your Interrupt, your Rebuke, a Stun, which is called a small range, a 10-yard range, 1-minute cooldown. Your movement ability is Divine Steed, and you just, it's a 45-second cooldown, and you basically mount up for 3 seconds, so you get an epic mount speed. It's very short, and it's a pretty long cooldown, so your movement isn't great, but it does allow you to get from place to place rather quickly. And then you do have some utility in Freedom. Your Blessing of Freedom basically applies this thing that removes all roots and snares and prevents their application for the next 8 seconds. Very nice to have. And we have our spammable heal in Flash of Light. Got a cast time like so, cast it on whoever you like. You don't use this too often if possible, because you lose DPS when you do that. But you can use it on things like, say, you get Rot on Nathedra. You're kind of out there, out of range for the most part, so you just sit there and heal yourself instead. Something like that can be quite useful. And finally, we do have our Slow in Hand of Hindrance. 30-second cooldown. For 10 seconds, they move really, really slow. Pretty simple there. So those are your spells and abilities. Now let's look at your talents. In your first tier, you're going to want Final Verdict. It's just a passive damage buff to your Templar's Verdict and your Divine Storm, and becomes the best choice as you go through and get more and more artifact traits that increase the damage of those abilities. Now, technically, you do get a little boost in DPS if you use Execution Sentence for single target, for example, early on before those traits come into play. And same with Consecration for like big AoE pools, but I do recommend Final Verdict even then, just to kind of get used to not having, or basically not having to learn this different rotation with these two talents when you're going to eventually switch over to Final Verdict anyway. Just note that Execution Sentence does cost Holy Power, so anything that affects spenders, those Holy Power spenders you have, will apply to this as well if you do choose to use that. Now level 30, we've got 3 really good talents that all affect your DPS. Fires of Justice reduces the cooldown of your Crusader Strike. It gives you a chance to proc this little buff on yourself that reduces the cost of your Holy Power spenders. So like if you have that buff, then Templar's Verdict, for example, will cost 2 Holy Power the next time you use it, rather than 3. Pretty simple and very nice for single target situations. And just kind of as a default choice, I like to have that. It kind of smooths out the rotation since it reduces the cooldown of Crusader Strike. Now, Zeal replaces Crusader Strike, and it makes it so that you get a buff that makes your Zeal chain. Kind of like a chain lightning, bounces between enemies, does a little damage. So it's nice for kind of small AoE and cleave. In raid instances, I suggest for you use it on like 3 target fights, if they're clumped up enough for the effect to jump. And it's also really useful in Mythic Plus kind of Keystone dungeons. Very nice for that consistent cleave, that constant cleave, where you don't have to have a bunch of Holy Power ready to take advantage of Divine Storm and such. Really, really good for that. And it does well in smaller packs in case you have those, instead of larger packs. Now, for super large AoE packs, like 4+ targets, Greater Judgment is really, really good. And it makes it so your Judgment hits 4 targets instead of 2. And every time you use Judgment on a add that has 50% or more health, it always crits. You don't get full value from this, of course, if there are less than 4 targets, because you're missing a judgment that you could have had. So that's extra damage you're missing out. But for really big AoE packs, this is really nice, because then you also get the extra debuff, the judgment debuff, that increases the damage of, say, your Divine Storm. Now you can use this in Mythic Plus as well if you really, really need that huge AoE. You plan to be pulling everything in the dungeon like all at once, just giant pools of huge AoE. It'll do better than Zeal, but Zeal's kind of a nice compromise, if you will, kind of a nice middle ground between the single target of Fires of Justice and the mass AoE of Greater Judgment, which is why I generally recommend that for Mythic Plus, but it kind of depends on what you need for your specific comp. So see what they need. If they need lots of single target, like they have plenty of AoE, like Windwalker Monks and Fire Mages and stuff like that, BM Hunters, then you might just focus on single target or go Zeal, so one of these two. And if you have a lot of single target DPS, like you have a Feral Druid or something, I don't know, and you need lots of AoE, then you could go Greater Judgment to focus on those big pools. But again, talk to your group what you need for those. But for Raid, single target fires, 3 targets, single target and 2 targets, Fires of Justice, because that Holy Power generation kind of outweighs the little Zeal cleave you get. 3 targets that you can cleave, Zeal, and then 4+, constant 4+ targets in a fight, you could go Greater Judgment. Now level 45, 3 CC talents, basically, I'll go over them briefly, but Repentance, not that impressive in PvE, don't really recommend it. It has a cast time, kind of disorients something for, kind of like Sap, so for about a minute, and it will break on damage, but you don't really use that too often. Now, Fist of Justice basically makes it so that your Hammer of Justice comes off cooldown faster. Every time you use Holy Power, it reduces the cooldown of that ability. So if you need more consistent stuns, whether in like a dungeon or a raid, this is your talent of choice. And then Blinding Light is a 1.5 minute cooldown, and it looks like this. It just kind of blinds enemies around you. And it's on a 1.5 minute cooldown and disorients them for a few seconds. If they take damage though, that's not holy. So non-holy damage will break that effect, but it does help interrupt like trash packs, and it does a decent amount of AoE damage. So it can be used if you don't have enough holy power or resources to, Divine Storm or something. You can use it for AoE damage, a little burst of that, and for like trash packs in a Mythic Plus, you could use that possibly to interrupt briefly. And so it's kind of up to you what you need between Fist and Blinding Light, but generally I default to Blinding Light for AoE damage. Now level 60, you've got choices between, again, 3 DPS improving talents. Right now I recommend Blade of Wrath for most situations. And what it does is it gives you your auto attack the chance to reset the cooldown on Blade of Justice, your Holy Power builder, one of them. And it actually procs quite often, so you can expect to get a lot more Holy Power by using this talent, which improves, of course, both your single target and AoE DPS, and it kind of helps smooth out the rotation a little bit. Obviously, there's some RNG, some random nature of that, so you might get dry spells where you don't get a lot of procs, and then you kind of have dead time, but that just happens, and it's generally quite good. Now, Virtue's Blade just makes your Blade of Justice crit harder. So when it crits, it does 3 times the damage instead of 2 times the damage. The higher your crit goes, the better this talent gets, and at higher levels, I believe it will pass and does pass Blade of Wrath. I'm thinking probably like 27, maybe even higher, where this might start to outperform Blade of Wrath, but rotationally, you get more downtime. It is more consistent though, so you can kind of learn it and feel it out and get used to how to use it. Whereas Blade of Wrath, you kind of have to pay attention to those procs all the time and see when they pop up. So if one of those 2 playstyles really appeals to you or you hate that style, then pick the other one, and so on. So pick whatever you enjoy most, but generally Blade of Wrath, until you get super high crit levels, will do you better overall. Now Divine Hammer, it replaces your Blade of Justice, and it's an AoE ability. And it no longer gets its cooldown reduced by haste, unfortunately, so it's 12 seconds all the time. And as you see, you use it, and it spins hammers, and they do damage around you. Really good for big AoE. One cool thing that you'll notice, it does generate 2 Holy Power, but if you just have it spinning and then walk up and have it damage something, it will actually proc the 2 Holy Power, and then, for example, as you saw, I waited for the cooldown, and then you can use it again right away whenever it's up. So if you are using this in like a dungeon or something, you can pre-Divine Hammer before Trash Pack, and then run in and kind of burst a little bit harder. Generally, I don't use this in raids too often, but it would be useful for like super big AoE, and again, all the time, like AoE all the time, ads everywhere kind of thing. Doesn't really exist in Emerald Nightmare, at least right now. But it makes sure your single target damage suffer too much to use it unless there's ads, like always. Now, in dungeons, again, this is kind of up to what you need in your group. If your group is suffering for lack of single target, then don't take Divine Hammer. Take Blade of Wrath or Virtue's Blade. And then if your group is like really needs AoE, a lot of it, then Divine Hammer could be useful then. But in general, I recommend Blade of Wrath for most situations, and if you like it, you like the more consistent playstyle, or you have super high crit, then Virtue's Blade is really good. So level 75, we got some survivability talents. Now, an eye for an eye, pretty simple. It's a 1 minute cooldown. It reduces the damage you take, physical damage, for the duration, and it makes you counterattack anyone that hits you in melee range. Kind of a nice cooldown if you're taking physical damage from whatever source. Word of Glory heals yourself and up to 5 friendly targets for a decent amount, and it's got 2 charges on a 1 minute recharge. It does cost Holy Power, so of course, like in a raid or anything, it will be a DPS loss, but in things like a Mythic Plus, it can be really useful to off-heal because you only have 1 healer, and it's really nice to have that extra ability to heal if need be. So it's going to be useful in that if you want to use it to kind of help the group out. Just to Cause Vengeance, the 5 Holy Power ability, it doesn't do as much damage as Templar's Verdict though, per Holy Power especially, because it costs so much and doesn't do quite as much damage. It does notably heal you though for the amount of damage you do, and it does twice the damage against stun targets, thus twice the healing as well. So for self-sustain, this can be quite nice if you're like soloing content or something, paired up with Divine Purpose especially. But basically, this is kind of more self-sustain. If you need to in an emergency, it's still a DPS loss, whereas Word of Glory is kind of like a group sustain. So I do recommend this for, say, dungeons. Not so much for raids, but because there's more healers, but if you really need to, you could. And eye for an eye for anything where you just want to reduce the physical damage you take at a certain fight, or something like that. So probably more raid-oriented if there are physical raid-wide AoE damage going out, like on Ursoc, for example. Now, at level 90, we've got talents related to movement speed and survivability, so you kind of have to make a choice here. I like to default to Divine Intervention. It reduces the cooldown on your Divine Shield, which is that immunity spell, by half, so 2.5 minutes instead of 5. And also, if you happen to die, it'll actually trigger the Divine Shield automatically and put you to 20% health instead of 0 or 1. Do note that if you have Forbearance on you, or Divine Shield's on cooldown, of course it won't proc, but this is really nice and kind of helps you survive, especially if you don't know what's going on in the fight, or you don't expect the damage, and just having that cooldown reduction is pretty big anyway. And Cavalier, if you need more movement speed, this is what I would recommend. It gives your Divine Steed 2 charges instead of 1, so you can mount up more often. And Seal of Light, I don't really recommend. It costs Holy Power and it makes you move 20% faster, which is not a whole lot, and you're using Holy Power, which is also not great. So I don't really recommend that if possible, versus the other two. Level 100, I recommend Crusade, pretty much all situations for group content, so when you're doing high-end PvE. It replaces Avenging Wrath, and instead of giving you all this damage up front, it gives you a little bit of damage and haste, and every time you spend Holy Power, you get stacks, and these stacks increase your damage and haste by an additional little bit, up to 15 stacks. So basically you start off small and you build up to 15 stacks, and then you're hitting like a truck and hitting really quickly because you have super haste as well. It really helps your burst, and it's just better than the other two options. Now Holy Wrath, 3-minute cooldown, it's based on your missing health, so they'll lower the health that you're at the more this does, which of course is kind of difficult in a raid especially, but even in a dungeon, because your healer is probably trying to heal you up. So it's hard to tell them, hey, no, don't heal me. Plus, it's a 3-minute cooldown, so you kind of lose out on damage anyway. It only happens every so often. And then Divine Purpose is not bad for leveling, and it just makes it so that when you spend Holy Power, you've got a chance to get a buff, and this buff makes your next Holy Power spender free. So in that case, you could use Justicar's Vengeance, right? Because it's free, so it doesn't matter how much holy power it costs, but it just doesn't do as well as Crusade. So don't generally recommend this if you're like soloing stuff out in the world during World Quest. It's probably not a terrible choice, or while you're building up your artifact weapon, but in general, Crusade is going to be your best option. Now let's go ahead and look at your artifact traits and kind of pathing choices. Now, you start over here at Wake of Ashes, of course, drop over to Blade of Light, and then you have an option which way to go here. You do want to go to Ashes, this golden trait, first. No matter how you get there, you want to go there first. And this buffs your Wake of Ashes to also give you 5 holy power, so it turns into a holy power generator, which is really awesome, and it basically doubles its damage as dot damage. So really, really nice. Gotta have this. If you don't mind going around the long way and not having Ashes to Ashes for a long time, you can just go around the way I did. So go down this path and kind of follow these traits all the way up to Ashes, and then you won't waste any artifact power that way. Or if you must have it early because you want to be able to perform well and quickly, you can go straight to it, this shorter path, but you'll pick up these kind of so-so traits or irrelevant traits. And so what you do is you get Ashes to Ashes the quick way, and then you will save up artifact power. You will not spend any, you will not buy new traits. Save up like 68,000, I believe it is, artifact power. Don't spend any of that, and then reset, and then you'll be able to go all the way around and get there. And you won't have wasted like all these points that you have to pay for later. Now, you will spend about 30 to 50 artifact power. You kind of waste that on the reset, but if you want to have this quick, it's a good way to get this and then not have to stay with these extra 7 points, excuse me, not 9, but 7 kind of dead points. Now, do you know, of course, that you will eventually get all the traits, so it's not a huge deal. If you just choose to stay with it, go straight to Ashes, and kind of go from there, that's fine too. But this is first, definitely, however you want to get there. And then you want to get Echo of the High Lord down here, and then just make sure to Templar's Verdict and Divine Storm basically do 10% more damage. And then grab Divine Tempest down here, which buffs your Divine Storm, and this is the one that makes your Divine Storm kind of fly forward in front of you, as you saw during the Spells and Abilities section. And then, if you haven't already, pick up Righteous Blade, and then the rest of the traits, these last 3 here, if you don't have them. As far as relics go, it's really good to have Wrath of the Ashbringer. This is your best relic trait, if possible. So try to find relics that do buff this. And if you can't find that, generally find like single target ones. So things like Crusader Strike, Crit Chance, Templar's Verdict damage, Blade of Justice damage, and so on, Judgment, things like that, if you can. Now as far as stats go, haste is going to be your top stat, and you want enough haste so that your Judgment debuff is available. So your Judgment is available to debuff the targets anytime you want to spend Holy Power. So whenever you're about to spend Templar's Verdict or cast Divine Storm, you always want to be able to make sure you have a Judgment debuff up. So you want enough haste to have that available all the time. So not all the time up on the target, but anytime you need it. And that occurs, I believe, around 20 to 22% haste-ish. Now, past that, having more haste than that is not a bad thing, but the other stats start to get a little bit more value per point than haste after that point. So about 20% haste, or however much makes you comfortable in your rotation for keeping up Judgment when you need it. And then after that, Critical Strike is really good, especially if you go toward Virtue's Blade. Higher the crit, the better, of course, but just in general, your second best stat there. And then Versatility, just a flat damage increase. And then Mastery is your worst stat, pretty much always. It just increases your Judgment damage, and it increases the debuff, so that Judgment debuff, like how much it increases your Holy Power spender damage. But it only affects those 2 things, thus every other stat is better because they affect all of your abilities. So haste to about 20-22%. More is fine though. Then crit, then versatility, and then just at the bottom always is mastery. Now let's go ahead and look at your DPS rotation. Now I will mention that it's very similar between single target, and AoE. The only real difference is for single target, you'll be using your Holy Power on Templar's Verdict, and for AoE, it'll be on Divine Storm instead. Literally, pretty much the only difference. So, there's the concept in your rotation that you will build Holy Power, and then you will apply the Judgment debuff, and then you'll spend Holy Power. And that's pretty much the crux of your rotation. So in general, you want to use Blade of Justice as much as you can on cooldown, especially if you're using Blade of Wrath, because you never know when that proc's going to come along and you're going to get a free reset on the cooldown. So you want to use that as much as possible. You also never want to overcap your Holy Power though. So if you're already at 4 Holy Power, don't use Blade of Justice because you'll waste that Holy Power. But basically on cooldown as much as possible, and then fill in other times you need to generate Holy Power with Crusader Strike. Now you do want to pull up your Holy Power before you Judgment, typically to 5 ideally, but even going to like 4 or 3 if you must, and there's no way you can generate more Holy Power without waiting a long time, then you will Judgment, and then you will spend your Holy Power. Again, Templar's Verdict for single target, and Divine Storm for AoE. Now, you will Divine Storm pretty much only at 3+ targets, so make sure there's at least 3 things there before you start using AoE. As far as Wake of Ashes go, remember that it does generate 5 Holy Power once you get your first golden trait, so make sure you've emptied out your Holy Power before you use it. Losing 1 Holy Power is not the worst thing in the world if you kind of waste one, but any more than that, you're really kind of gimping yourself and should just clear out your Holy Power before you get to use this. And that's pretty much your rotation. So you generate Holy Power, try to keep Blade of Justice on cooldown, use it as much as possible with the Blade of Wrath talent, and then kind of Crusader Strike when you need to fill in and generate Holy Power when this is not available. Then Judgment when you're ready to spend all your pulled up Holy Power, ideally 5 or 4, and then spend it, and then generate and spend it. And you do want to pull up because you want to spend as much time as possible using Templar's Verdict or Divine Storm rather than generating Holy Power during that kind of Judgment debuff window. Now, if you're using Virtue's Blade, it's a lot more controlled. You will get used to the rotation more and just kind of weave in. You still want to use Blade of Justice as much as possible because it does a lot of damage, but you're not too worried about resets. So you kind of get a feel for it. Kind of look at the timers, your cooldown timers. You do want to keep Crusader Strike rolling as much as possible so it's not stuck at 2 charges for too long. But kind of look at your timers as they come up and see what you can do to make sure that you fill up to 5 Holy Power or however much you can without having much downtime. And I'll kind of show you how that goes in the demonstration. Now, as far as your burst rotation, it does change a little bit. When you use Crusade, you want to have pulled up 5 Holy Power, and then you want to Judgment, and then Crusade, and then spend as much Holy Power as fast as you can. So remember that every Holy Power you spend makes you go faster and do more damage. You're trying to build up to 15 stacks as quickly as possible while outputting the maximum damage. And so as you get higher stacks, it becomes more forgiving because you have super high haste. So if you run out of generators, and you'll see this in the demonstration, but if you run out of generators, you can Judgment early, and that's fine because most likely your Judgment will be up by the time you need it again because the cooldown will be so short based on your haste. So it's a lot more forgiving, and if there's dead time where you can't build enough Holy Power to spend, you can just Judgment, and that'll kind of fill in the space for you. So basically, you will build to 5 Holy Power, Judgment, Crusade, Templar's Verdict or Divine Storm again, single target AoE. Build Holy Power based on the priority, so generally Blade of Justice on cooldown, no matter which talent you're using, at level 60, because again your haste is super high. And then Templar's Verdict, spend it all, etc. Now if you have Wake of Ashes available, then you will use this when you've emptied your Holy Power, ideally early so that you can use it to generate Holy Power faster, and thus build your stacks faster. But at the beginning, I will recommend using this at the start anyway, so you won't be able to do that. But in general, you're just trying to build and then spend Holy Power as quickly as you can in Crusade. And although it's kind of fast-paced, you'll get used to it, and it's a little more forgiving in a way, like I said, because of that haste. Now I'll go ahead and demonstrate on these dummies. And I'm going to be using Blade of Wrath first, so you can kind of see how that goes. Now, the burst rotation for both talents, Virtue's Blade and Blade of Wrath, pretty much identical, just you won't be getting resets if you're using Blade of Virtue, or, excuse me, Virtue's Blade. But basically the same, and the difference will be outside of the burst rotation. I will open with Wake of Ashes, as I mentioned. 5 Holy Power there, then Judgment, and then Crusade and off to the races. Now you will be able to see the abilities I'm using on the left side of the screen here, where I'm kind of circling my mouse. And it'll show you the last ability I've just cast, so you can follow along a bit better if it's going a bit quick. So I'll start, and I'll open, of course, pre-pot, and then open with Wake of Ashes, Judgment, and then Crusade, and then spend Holy Powers to Templars, and then build and spend Holy Powers, and then just spend as much as you can, basically. Now, if I have dead time, of course I can Judgment early if I need to, because your haste is so high, it's going to be okay. You're not going to have dead time, really, in these rotations. Now, make sure you do have Judgment, of course, applied anytime you want a Templar's Verdict or Divine Storm for AoE. And you just kind of go off here. Now, notice that Wake of Ashes is getting pretty close to coming off cooldown, so I'll keep that in mind. And then I will go ahead and spend my Holy Power here, Wake of Ashes, and then follow the priority. So I will use my Blade of Justice as much as possible because, I don't know when the cooldown resets are going to be. Get as much Holy Power as I can without having to wait, which is 4 in this case, and then Judgment, and then spend on Templar's Verdict. Spend that Holy Power. Now here, I'm not going to make it. I knew I couldn't make it there before I ran out of Judgment time, so I'll just get the 4, which is the highest I could, without waiting a long time, and then spend Holy Power after that's a Judgment, then spend. Now here, I can build up to 5 because I wasn't confident in squeezing in that last Templar's Verdict. Now I see I have Wake of Ashes ready, so I'll empty my Holy Power, use it, and then here again I can't squeeze in comfortably, so I'll wait for the next Judgment and build up Holy Power instead. And this is pretty much how the rotation goes. You kind of watch when Blade of Justice comes off cooldown, when it just pops off on its own. And if it does, sometimes you'll have the time like this. Now I have 3 here. I happen to get a proc, which is cool. Judgment. And then just build Holy Power and spend Holy Power as fast as possible while this Judgment debuff is active. And that's pretty much the rotation. Just kind of keep an eye on your timers, especially for Crusade, in which you want to pull up 5 Holy Power before you use it mid-fight. And then, of course, you Wake of Ashes, so you're not waiting too long in it, because you do want it to line up with your Crusade as much as possible, or at least have like a couple seconds, like where Wake of Ashes only has a couple seconds of cooldown left when you have Crusade ready, so it's available when you need it. So that's the rotation with Blade of Wrath. Now with Virtue's Blade, again, the burst rotation will look very similar, and for, again, AoE, just substitute Divine Storm for Templar's Verdict. Pretty simple. And in this case, it'll really be the same, open the same way, everything the same, just kind of follow the rotation as you can. So I'll start with Wake of Ashes, Judgment, Crusade, and then spend Holy Power and build it, and then build Holy Power and spend it, and you just do it as best you can without having dead time. So Judgment, put that debuff up, make sure it's available before I start doing Templar's Verdicts and such, building Holy Power, and using Blade of Justice as much as possible. Make sure you debuff with Judgment before you spend Holy Power. Keep an eye, of course, on that Wake of Ashes timer, see when it's coming off. And in this case, it is coming off right about now, so I'll go ahead, Judgment here, clear out my Holy Power, then use Wake of Ashes, so I'm not wasting Holy Power. Get this rolling, and here I'll try to build up as much Holy Power as I can without waiting. I get 5, Judgment, and then spend Holy Power. Blade is off cooldown, so I'll use that. And then squeeze in Templar's Verdict. Now here, I'm going to have to wait because I don't have enough Holy Power, and I'm not going to Judgment until I have some Holy Power enough to actually use a Templar's Verdict right away, at the very least. Now Wake of Ashes is coming off cooldown soon, so I'll go ahead and get 3 Holy Power here. Squeeze in that last hit. Wake of Ashes, Judgment, and then kind of back off to the races again. Blade came off cooldown, and you kind of just find your rhythm. Get used to when you need to use it and when you need to hold off so that you get a smoother generation of 5 Holy Power and so on. But pretty much the same rotation, just without the extra procs. Now again, as a reminder, just if you were doing AoE, just swap Divine Storm into the rotation rather than Templar's Verdict, but it's exactly the same other than that. So that's your rotation. Now as far as macros and add-ons go, I pretty much just use a couple macros, just the one for if you have an unused trinket, like Horn of Valor or Faulty Countermeasure that has a 2-minute cooldown, lines up perfectly with your Crusade or Avenging Wrath. I will macro them together like so, and I'll copy and paste this for you guys in the description. But basically just use the item, whatever item you have, and then cast Avenging Wrath. I do suggest you use Avenging Wrath in the text here, because it auto-updates to Crusade, and I don't think it goes the other way around if you like type in Crusade, so I do recommend that. And then for the Holy Power bar, where I move it up here, it is a script that I have figured out. I kind of copied from someone for another class, and then I figured out what to change. And basically, you can set. I'll copy and paste this as well in the description, but basically, you will change this number, this 2 here, to whatever size you want it to be. So if you want to make it bigger or smaller or whatever, you'll change that number, and then to move it, you will change this coordinate set. So the 0 and the -60. It's like a grid, so X-Y axis type thing. Just change that to wherever you'd like to move it. And then the problem, or not the problem, but something to know about that is every time you reload your UI, every time you log out, log in, you will have to click it again. So you have to constantly use it basically if you ever reload or log out to another character, stuff like that. So just be aware of that. As far as add-ons go, I do use weak ores, as you saw in the demonstration. You can do a lot of stuff with it. I just keep it pretty basic. I just track the cooldown timers on stuff like my Avenging Wrath or Crusade, my Wake of Ashes and such, to kind of know when they're up so I can plan and prepare for them. And then also my rotational stuff, my Judgment, Blade of Justice, Crusader Strike with stacks as well. So again, I can plan, see what's coming, see what's up, what's available, and plan how I want to rotate those abilities to make the rotation smoother. I also have a Judgment debuff timer, which is really good to have. As you may have noticed in the demonstration, sometimes I was able to squeeze in a last Templar's Verdict because I knew I had just enough time, and sometimes I held off because I said, no, I'm not going to make it in time, it'd be kind of a waste of damage. So it's nice to have that. And then I do have a Fires of Justice buff indicator, so I know when I have that, so I know when my Holy Power spenders will going to cost a little less. Now I do have a link to my weak aura list in the description below, so feel free to browse that as you like for whatever class I have them for. And then if you guys noticed that flashing icon in the middle of the screen showed like the icon of the spell when it came off cooldown, that was actually a separate add-on called Doom Cooldown Pulse, and there's a link to that as well in the description. I don't really recommend it to people, I just kind of haven't gotten around to getting rid of it. And the problem with it right now is it's a little buggy sometimes, like it will tell you something's off cooldown and it's not. It'll be close, but it's not quite off cooldown. And you can actually produce the exact same effect with more accuracy in weak auras, so I really don't recommend it, but a lot of people do ask, so I just wanted to let you guys know what that was. And that's pretty much it for add-ons that I use that are related to DPS. Now, I hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you did, feel free to hit it with a like. If you want to see when I post new videos like this, feel free to subscribe to the channel. And if you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave those in the comment section below. Thanks for watching, guys. Hope you enjoyed. Cheers.